3 Lives 3 Worlds. The Pillow Book. Lower volume. Original work by Tangqi Gongzi. English translation, Hamster 428. English editing, rockharlequin, Lily, JoannaKuang. Part 4 The Shadow's Souls. Chapter 15. The highest place at the princess's estate was Boxen Pavilion. Ancient trees surrounded it, each toweringly sky-high. With the sunlight filtering in, the small pavilion was shrouded under a layer of antiquity. At this time, there were 4 people inside the pavilion, Donghua Daijun and Archmage Chen Ye sitting opposite one another, a sleeping Fengju in Daijun's arms, and Su Moi standing with hung hands. All the right people in the right place at the right time. Objectively speaking, it made for a rather fine picture. Because the 2 men in front of him were both relatively calm and quiet, the second Prince Su Moi was quite confused watching the show before his eyes. Although he had always been great at reading people's faces, he had been tortured by Daijun in recent days in making the magical instrument. His exhausted brain was a little numb at the moment. Furthermore, he hadn't recovered from the shock which happened 3 days prior. 3 days ago was a lucky day. Heaven was compassionate for a turn and made his 12th letter to Daijun take effect in recalling Daijun back to Qinan Palace. After urging Daijun to the point of vomiting blood, His Majesty at last came back and he could finally swallow back his blood. He was hoping to leave the mountain for a break after finishing the magical instrument. Daijun never actually said what kind of magical object he was making. In the spirit of a vassal's duty, he hadn't asked and only did what he was told. He only found out after Daijun returned to the shrine at the time it was finished. It was a mirror, but not any ordinary one. It was the Miaohua glass. He had heard of the Miaohua glass hanging in the 7th celestial sky of Zhukongtian before. It was said that this glass could reproduce the wax and wane of billions of mortal worlds in the great Trichilio cosm. That being said, Fanyan Valley was a fairy land, it was not a land of the mortals. The Miaohua glass shouldn't be able to show its past events. He was slightly stumped. If not for this function, what did Daijun waste his effort to make this looking glass for? He couldn't possibly have made it as a vanity mirror for Fengju, could he? On second thought, he damn well could have. Thank heavens, Daijun wasn't so outrageous this time. When the glass was completed, His Majesty studied it for a moment, then wrote something on a piece of paper and threw it into the glass. Soon after, a clear little scene appeared. The scene within the looking glass startlingly stunned him. It was the snake pit by Jiayu Spring more than 200 years ago. In the hail, 4 bloodshot-eyed pythons were hissing skyward, laden with the pain of losing their child. The little girl in his arms stretched her limbs outward, struggling to return to the snake pit. Her eyes were twinkling with tears, her mouth was hissing a language of the snake species. He was standing on a cloud as his jasper flute floated in the air. No one was playing it, but from it came a snake-repellent song. The little girl continued to resist his hold. He could have used magic to restrain her, but whatever he was thinking at the moment, he only used his hands to lock the girl who loved to hide behind the stones to listen to his flute in his arms. Unable to do a thing, her eyes welled up with tears. He stroked her forehead and softly said, "You're very smart. Though you don't speak, you can understand what I say. You're not a snake, but the second princess of the Bianiao clan. Do you want to live as a snake in this tiny hole and be treated as an outcast by your clansmen? Or do you want to spread your wings and soar in the sky? Tears pooled in the little girl's eyes. After a long time, she bit down on her lip as if she was enduring a great pain. A flutter sounded as a pair of white wings instantaneously unfolded from her shoulders. She imitated his sound. "Bye." He smiled. "Good child, is this the first time you opened your wings? From now on, I will be your teacher." The biennials could either have one wing or two wings. Aranya was a double-winged biennial. Needless to say, he was caught astonished to revisit the emotions of many years ago. Daijun already stewed a pot of tea and poured for them 2 cups. He casually said, "I've altered this mirror a bit to be able to see the current and past lives of immortals." Looking at the Miaohua glass, he added, "It was likely Chen Ye who created this world. I wanted to take a look at what he wanted to do and see whether Xiao Bai had anything to do with Aranya. Stay here to watch with me. If anything happens, you can take care of it for me." For the time being, he ignored Daijun's allowing him to stay while expecting him to continue his unpaid work. His brain became muddled for a brief second. There was a tremble in his voice. "Your Majesty, are you saying that this mirror can show why Aranya died?" Was this very surprising? Daijun asked in seeming puzzlement. He collected his emotions and answered, "I did not know there was an instrument that could show past lives of immortals." "It's very surprising, yes." He then said, "I heard the Miaohua glass could only reveal one side of things." "Your Majesty, is this past only from Chen Yi's point of view?" Daijun faintly nodded his head. He poured more tea and reminded him, "Don't touch the glass's frame. Be careful not to let your mind be disturbed by the thoughts of the people in the glass." Regrettably, his reminder was so leisure and careless that Mo Xiao's hand had already touched the frame out of curiosity. Within a split second, a heavy emotion struck right into his heart through the glass frame that was connected to his hand. It was as if he was suddenly reliving a stretch of life. Someone else's life. Chen Yi's life. Mo Xiao recalled Aranya had told him some years ago that the first time she met Chen Ye was a few days before his 10th birthday. At the time, she had just left the snake pit. Although she had a teacher who cared for her, the enormous palace often felt too lonely, and she wanted to be friends with everyone she met. She was taking a turn in the garden that day. From behind an old apricot tree, she saw Chen Ye, Junyo, and Changdi playing a guessing game of plants among the flower beds ahead. Already looking exceptionally handsome, this cousin of hers was even more dashing and magnificent under that day's sunlight. She wanted to be his friend even more. It was only a few more days until his birthday. She thought that it was a good opportunity to befriend him, and so she should go to offer her well wishes. Recalling his graceful demeanor when he was standing among the elegant flowers that day, she had wanted to visit the garden to pick a handful of blooms as gifts. Unexpectedly, her plan failed because flowers lived such a fleeting life. From how they appeared in her memory, she sketched them back amateurishly onto a piece of paper. Then, she carefully carried the drawing with her to her uncle's home. On that birthday, he didn't wear his everyday clothes as he did in the garden. Instead, he wore a shrine outfit, appearing mature and handsome beyond his years. He was again with Junyo and Changdi. When he saw her from afar, he immediately averted his indifferent eyes elsewhere. In the afternoon, she found the drawing she had given him in a small ditch in the backyard. The ink had been so soaked that the original picture couldn't be traced out anymore. Her youngest sister, Xiangli, stood by the ditch and taunted her. "Chen Yegag said you were raised by snakes and chewed rotten sod to grow up. How terribly filthy! He doesn't want your drawing." When she later told him this story, she had laughed and said she and Chen Ye had only seen each other twice like that in their childhood. Since then, she didn't entertain the thought of getting close to Chen Ye again, neither did she visit her maternal uncle's home anymore. She and Chen Ye had had no fate from the very beginning. When she later insisted on having a fate with Chen Ye, he didn't know himself whether her insistence was right or wrong. Mo Xiao believed Arania did insist, and he was convinced that her insistence for this romance had planted her fatal curse. As for Chen Yi's feelings toward Arania, he didn't believe he could possibly have any feelings for her. If he had loved her, how could he watch her walk to her death like that? Taking a step back, he had been sick of her for decades. They only got along better for but 2 years. There could be a number of feelings in those 2 years, but none could be said to be very deep. As for his actions after Arania's death, they were just spurred by the common regret of knowing what he had only after he lost it. Chen Ye did not love Arania. If he did, it would be the greatest joke. And yet heaven liked to tease. The emotions within the Miaohua glass surged like flood water. The color on Mo Xiao's face gradually drained white. Dai Jun sipped some tea and asked him, "Can you still bear it?" His poor face scrunched up into a smile. "Your Majesty, what if I can and what if I cannot?" Dai Jun gave a concise advice, "Just hang in there." Everyone said the cold and reticent archmage was highly enigmatic. One could speculate the king's royal will, but it was only a self-guessing game if one were to try predicting the archmage's thoughts. Yet at this time, the thoughts of this indecipherable archmage were bluntly presented to Mo Xiao in plain sight. It was so clear, as if he was Chen Ye himself. Chen Yi's holy birth wasn't very peaceful. When his mother was carrying him, she was taken to the shrine to await her due date. But there had been no strange omen in the sky on the day he was born. When she gave birth to him, he was a very frail baby, so weak he did not even cry. The incumbent archmage, Zeiss, wasn't in at the time. A few ungenerous magi had grumbled and mumbled, wanting to expel his mother and him out of the shrine. Fortunately, Shangjun Xiangli Yin happened to pass by on his way to the shrine to take sanctuary from the summer heat. Kindly, he had kept him and his mother back. When he saw his breathing was becoming weaker, Xiangli Yin promptly cut his wrist and saved his life with a bowl of his blood. His first cry came in the afternoon. There was originally only a blazing sun in the eastern sky. But suddenly, there climbed a full moon. For a brief moment, the sun and moon simultaneously shone. Xiangli Yin laughed, "Well, isn't this our clan's little archmage? Since his descending from heaven is so brilliant and beautiful, why not name him Yet, Bright/Sparkle? He used his mother's surname in combination with the name bestowed by Xiangli Yin and was thereafter called Chen Yet. King Xiangli Yin decided on his mother's marriage and promised her hand to his brother-in-law. His mother thus moved out of the shrine to her husband's home. At the time, he had just turned 1 and was designated as the next archmage. He remained at Qinan Palace where he was raised in reverence. He followed the then incumbent archmage, Zais, and learned from him the ability of a high priest. Time fleetingly flew by. He was 5 by the time tumult occurred below the mountain. Lord Zais ate mung bean cakes as he warned him that although Qinan Palace held the monitoring post, if the king's misconduct wasn't severe enough to result in widespread destruction, it wasn't in the shrine's jurisdiction to interfere. The contention in the palace was those people's own battle to fight. If we were interested, we'd come to join in the fun. If not, we'd shut our gates and have drinks and cakes. They closed the palace gates and enjoyed mung bean cakes for several days when finally came the news that a new king had ascended the throne. He was even marrying the previous king's wife, Lady King Hua, as queen consort. Palace rights officials came to ask for the archmage's benediction. Zais excused himself, citing that he was too full from mung bean cakes and wasn't in the condition to travel. He sent a few of his attendants to take Chen Ye to the palace instead. It was his first time presiding over a prayer ceremony. He was only 5 years old, but he did not make any mistake. Zais was very pleased. From then on, he became increasingly lazy. Whenever there was anything that required the archmage, he never failed to send him in his place. His mother married King Hua's brother and thus King Hua became his aunt. Soon after, King Hua gave birth to Junyo. Because he regularly visited the palace, she often left the baby in his care. When he turned 10 that year, he left to the mountain for his training and for 2 years did not set foot in the imperial palace. By the time he returned, Junyo told him that her mother had given birth to a baby sister more than a year ago. Her sister was very cuddly and adorable, but her mother had tossed her into a snake pit. Fortunately, the 4 pythons did not eat the baby. They even captured rats and bit their necks to feed her their blood. There was only one snake pit in the imperial palace, it was by the Jiayu spring. Why he wanted to see the child mentioned by Junyo, he couldn't say for sure. That night, the moon was a frosty silver. He stepped onto the moonlight and was about to enter the garden when he heard a few palace servants whispering behind the bamboos. They said the child in the snake pit often crawled around during this hour, but for some reason they didn't hear any sound tonight. Could she have fallen ill? Did they need to report this to the queen? They pushed the task of reporting to the queen back and forth, but fearing the queen's ire, no one eventually volunteered. When the queen threw this child into the snake pit, they reckoned she had not wanted her to live. If the child got sick, it was exactly what the queen wished for. They would only be inflicting bad luck upon themselves if they were to go and report back to her. It was best to turn a blind eye. Like this, they gossiped a while then scattered away. He approached the snake pit. The 4 pillars stood still. Behind them toward the edge of the formation was an infant lying on her stomach trembling on the ground. It was a full moon on the 15th, the hour of extreme yin. The pythons within the pillars had gone to absorb lunar essence and had no time to look after the child. He avoided alarming the pythons and carefully hoisted himself at the formation's edge, barely reaching the child. Under the moonlight, he saw a dirty baby clutching a dead rat in her chest, her hands full of blood. She was his cousin. Also his cousin, Junyo was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. This child, however, was dressed in rags and lived filthily in a snake pit, her only source of food being rat blood. The infant lay shivering on the ground for a while. She broke out crying when she finally could not bear it anymore. As if someone was pinching down her voice, her cries were soft and weak. It was a broken, soundless cry, but it struck him deep in the heart. He didn't know what the baby was suffering from. He didn't know what medicine she needed either. But there was nothing more effective in Fanyin Valley than the Archmage's blood. This, he knew. Due to the barricade of the snake pit's force field, he could not enter deep into the formation to bring the child out. All he could do was bite his finger and reach his hand into the force field to the child's lips. A few drops of blood flowed down as the child finally found enough strength to grab his finger and started to suckle. She had a big appetite. On top of that, she didn't know that his blood was only a medicine meant to cure her sickness. Instead, she treated it as a source of nourishment and suckled it until she was satiated as if it was rat blood before she would release him. It was his blood that saved her life. Now, it was coursing in her body. He had never used his own blood to save anyone's life. It made this child feel special to him. He wiped her face with his sleeve and saw the child's facial features more clearly. Junyo said her sister was very cuddly and adorable. She was indeed very cuddly and adorable. He couldn't believe Lady Qinghua could be so heartless. The satiated child quietly looked at him with her clear big eyes. He stroked her forehead and smiled. The clever child imitated his look, a smile curving up from her tiny mouth. He patted her gently and coaxed her to sleep. She watched him with wide eyes for a time before eventually falling asleep. When the extreme yin hour passed, the python's vigilance returned. From then on, he regularly found opportunities to quietly go see the child whenever he came to the palace. However, only on the extreme yin night of the 15th could he usually come close to the snake formation. He later found out from Zeiss that the blood of the king could drowse the pythons into somnolence. In the name of worshipping ceremonies, he was able to reserve quite a bit of Shangjun's blood. With this method, he was finally able to enter the snake formation. There was once when he tried to see whether he could take the child outside with him, but for some reason, her soft arm had only touched the force field before the sleeping pythons suddenly awakened. If not for his quick reflex, he would have perished in one of the python's belly. He knew then that he was only a 10-year-old child. Despite being the successor to the Archmage, he was still so powerless. He felt sorry for this cousin and secretly looked after her for 5 years. He brought her food when she was hungry, he made her warm clothes from molted python skin when she was cold, and never once leaving a trace of his care. 5 years passed by without anyone finding out, freeing her from any ill luck she might be met with. She was thrown into the snake pit the moment she was born, and so she didn't have a name. She wasn't a snake, she was a princess of the Bianiao clan. She must have a name. Since her parents didn't want to give her one, he really hoped that he could. He named her Aranya, meaning Pacific. He wrote Aranya onto her palm and slowly read it aloud to her. Aranya, this is your name. In the future when I say this word, I am calling your name. The smart child followed suit and wrote on the ground with her finger, amusing him greatly. He used magic to etch those 3 syllables onto her arm, then gently told her to write according to them. The ignorant child clung onto his sleeve and blinked her eyes, struggling to say, yet. Ran. He softened his voice, yes, I am Chen Yat, your cousin. You are Aranya, Xiangli Aranya. Since days of yore, all succeeding archmagi must go on an ascetic retreat at the age of 15 for a long training. This training lasted 20 years. After completing this training, he would become the deputy archmage. There was little he cared for when he was young. His heart and mind had looked forward to that long retreat. Now that he was taking care of her, another day he could push it back was another day he had with her. But it was ultimately a responsibility he couldn't escape from. He worried that no one would look after her after he left and that she would repeat the mistake of drinking rat blood again. The night he departed, he planted a 4-season fruit tree in the snake pit for her and brought down sky water from the holy palace to irrigate it. In the blink of an eye, the plant flourished and bore fruits. He plucked one down and gave it to her, teaching her that from now on, if she was hungry she should eat this, if she was thirsty she should drink spring water from Jiayu spring, she mustn't live off of rats anymore. She was already 5 that year. She was born as lovely as jade and snow, but because of the poisonous miasma in the snake formation, she couldn't really remember things nor could she really speak. Nevertheless, she seemed to know that this was goodbye. She clutched his robe and wouldn't fall asleep. He watched her for a long time, then at length said, "You're still so little. I bet you'll forget me by the time I come back." The child assumed he was asking her to do something and nodded in half comprehension. He stroked her fringe. Under the white moonlight, 4-season flowers fluttered down with the wind. One fell onto her shoulders. He picked it up and wore it behind her ear. He caressed it, then stopped, faced the child and promised, "I'll be back. When I become the archmage, I'll be able to get you out of here." He paused and pulled the child into his embrace. "I'm your only family, Aranya. They don't want you, but you still have me." When he left that night, the child suddenly woke up from her dream and cried vehemently. But he did not look back, letting her cries gradually disappear behind him. 20 years felt like an entire lifetime. He returned to the palace on the night of the 15th. Shang Jun hosted a welcoming banquet for him. Anxious to see the child, he caught one news relating to her. It was that their special guest, the second prince of the West Sea, had broken into the Python formation. Shang Jun led his feasting court and hastily rushed to Jiayu Spring. He, too, immediately followed behind. Setting foot here again, everything was in ruins. Foremost into his eyes was the cottony cloud in the sky where a little girl was carried in the arms of a white-attired man. Her snakeskin skirt was covered underneath the man's outer robe. When the white robe was lifted by the wind, her long black hair flew out, revealing a childlike face that was extraordinarily delicate. 20 years of not seeing her, the child had grown up. Jiayu Spring's clear water became turbulent. The serpents persistently seethed in hisses. The jasper flute's notes softly floated in the air. The little girl was spreading her wings for the first time in the white-robed man's arms. No one in the royal family possessed wings as white and pure as hers. Snowy feathers floated down and landed on his outreaching fingertips. On the cloud, the white-robed man glanced down to the child's arm and all of a sudden said, "Aranya, what a meaningful word. Since you don't have a name, what's better than using Aranya?" He saw her stare at the white-robed man in bewilderment, intermittently uttering, "A, ran, yay." The white-robed man smilingly said, "Very good, Aranya. I am Sumoy of the West Sea. I am Chen Yat, your cousin. You are Aranya, Xiangli Aranya." The second prince carried her in the air. He nodded to Shang Jun, on his face was a smile. In the West Sea, if we wanted to raise a good boy, we would often let him experience life away from home. I reckon your majesty wanted to hone the second princess and thus left her in the formation. It's just that I quite like this child. I want to make her my disciple and have her with me so that I may teach her. Will you be so kind as to grant me this favor, your majesty?" His honorable words were clever. Shang Jun's expression was complicated, but he eventually relented. He saw the second prince stroking the child's forehead and whispering to her, "From now on, you no longer have to stay here. Are you happy to be coming with me?" She gently nodded her head, an innocent smile curving on her lips. She was smiling the way he had taught her as a child. As expected, she had forgotten him, but there were still traces of him left in her. After 20 years of training, he finally had enough strength to save her from the pythons. But he was not yet in power. Even if he rescued her, the only thing they could do was going into hiding. Compared to the protection he could give her, that of the West Sea's second princes was better. The moment the snake-repellent music stopped, a python suddenly raised its fangs skyward. Fine needles specifically made to deal with these pythons flew out from his fingertips. The ferocious python's attack was thwarted as it fell heavily onto the ground. He expressionlessly stuffed his hands back into his sleeves and, taking advantage of the courtiers clamoring, quietly left Jiayu spring. She was born ill-fated, he thought. Now her fate was finally improving. It was a welcoming thing. Through 20 long years of arduous training, through seasons of dull ascetic mountain life, he often thought of her. He was the foreordained archmage. His mother treated his birth as an honor and never regarded him as her son. Since she worshipped him more than she loved him, he hadn't ever tasted the feeling of love. He once told her he was her only family, but she was also his only family. He brought her back from the brink of death, gave her a name, and devoted all of his affection to her. He had a fixation, and it was her. But there was now a better pillar she could lean on. It was time, he thought, that he completely let go of his fixation before it became demons. Another 10 years passed by. He thought of her always, but not once did he mention a word about her nor came anywhere near her. Lady Qinghua gave birth to Changdi while he was away on his retreat. He reckoned her hatred for Xiangli Q had abated substantially by then, for compared to Aranya, Changdi had it much easier as a princess. When he returned and came to the palace, Junyo and Changdi often followed him around and brought Aranya up in front of him. Junyo had always been quiet and did not tend to argue about these things. Even so, she forgot the kindness she once had for Aranya in their younger days. And when Changdi spoke with so much rapture, she couldn't feel vexed even if she wanted to. One day, Changdi again brought her up. "Today, I heard an old palace servant say that when Aranya was still in the snake pit, she had drunk rat blood and eaten rat meat to live. Can you guys imagine that? Since she had drunk that much rat blood, most of the blood flowing in her body must have turned into rat blood too, right? Tisk, so filthy and base, I can't understand why father actually allowed her back into the clan, and as a princess to boot. She's not deserving. Cousin Chen yet, am I right? He thought to himself, if what flowing in her veins was rat blood because she had drunk rat blood, then wasn't it his blood coursing in her body if she had drunk his blood? This idea distracted him a little. Xiangli persisted in prompting him. Cousin, was what I said right or not? Impatient, he said to her coldly, if we're going to discuss bloodline, you know full well the one type of blood that is regarded as base by Qinan Palace. The color in Xiangli's face drained away. Regarded as base by Qinan Palace was an unchaste bloodline. In this respect, there was no difference between Xiangli's and Aranya's bloods. Even so, Aranya was raised by him and had drunk his blood. Even if she inherited her mother's unfaithful bloodline, what did it matter? Zeiss presided over fewer and fewer ceremonies in recent years and built a cottage in a bamboo grove behind Qinan Mountain. He then spread words that he had contracted a serious disease and needed to move in order to recover. Believing his words at first, he went to visit him at the cottage. He saw Zeiss holding his trouser legs catching fish barefoot in the river. His face seemed even more spirited than his own. Zeiss gave a few phony coughs, then said with a sincere expression, I'm unwell, but since I'm a strong-minded person, I really disdain the sickly kind. I may not look sick to you, but the truth is that I'm nearing my death. He assured the soon-to-die Zeiss, many of our colleagues told me they'll come to visit you in the near future. Your being so strong will surely impress them. The smile on Zeiss's face went rigid. It was said that subsequently, another mage went to visit Zeiss at his cottage. All he saw was a Zeiss confined to bed looking quite disheartened. Ever since Zeiss contracted his illness, everything at the shrine naturally fell onto his shoulders. This year, Zhukongtian's Taishang Lejun held a lecture on the theory of Zen at the Moonlight Garden on the 32nd celestial sky. He attended in place of Zeiss. At first, the gathering was said to last a long and dull 81 days. But because so many immortals were invited to the seminar, there formed a liveliness in the atmosphere. Taking advantage of the high spirits, the Fruit Fairy hosted a fruit party for the immortals, extending the event for 9 more days. He never thought that by the time he returned to Fanyan Valley, he would be hearing wedding music. Aranya got married. Her groom was Zeiss. It was a windy day. Qinan Palace floated in the sky. From it, a cloud stairway rolled down to the ground. Amid hazy sounds, Zeiss came down in his groom outfit and personally led his red-attired bride away from her palanquin. He held her hand and together, they ascended step by step toward the majestic palace gates. Behind the gates where he stood was a rootless Bodhi tree. He saw that she was wearing a red cloak in the same color as her bridal dress. Her veil covered most of her face, revealing only a pair of scarlet lips and a small white chin. He knitted his brow, took from his sleeve a black tail feather, and lightly blew it from his palm. Strong gusts suddenly picked up on the cloud stairway and lifted her veil. She patted her hand over her flying hair strands and raised her face, her eyebrows slightly exasperated. It had been a while since he saw her. She was beautiful like this. He was lost in thought. 4 season flowers had descended like snowfall on that night long, long ago. Under the flowering tree, he had hugged her younger self and whispered to her a promise, I'm your only family. Aranya, they don't want you, but you still have me. From the time he turned away a decade ago, that promise was no longer relevant. She would gain more loved ones, her teacher, her husband, and later her children, too. With one last glance, the wind gradually subsided. Zeiss rearranged the veil on her head. Her scarlet lips gave hint of a faint smile. It wasn't the smile he had taught her, but he knew another person who smiled like this. It was the second Prince Sumoy of the West Sea. Time flowed on unceasingly like water in a stream. No traces of him was left in her. It was as though he had never appeared in her life before. Zeiss brought her into the shrine where the doors closed heavily behind them. The black feather floated back into his hand. He had lost her 10 years ago, he could not say he was losing her again. Only, the wrong person by her side this time for some reason gave him far more pain than the time before. Another 20 years came and went. Zeiss abdicated his position and he succeeded him as the next Archmage, becoming the youngest Archmage in the history of Fanyan Valley. Zeiss feigned an appearance of being terminally ill and hid behind Qinan Mountain. When he went to the bamboo grove, Zeiss even teased him, "You are ridiculously handsome and ridiculously intelligent, pity you keep that straight face on all day long. Obviously, your serious face is more handsome than your smiling one, but you should still smile a bit now that you've come to bid me farewell. Make me feel more comfortable, He glanced around the bamboo grove but did not find any feminine accessory. He finally could not resist and asked, "Where's your wife?" Zeiss shook the damp quilt that was drying under the sun. "Why would a young lady like her stay here in seclusion with me? Of course she's at her home away from the mountain." He looked to the mountain scenery and lightly said, "You treat her very well." Zeiss smiled and proudly agreed, "She's really lucky to meet such a good person like me." It was said that in addition to his peerless appearance, this Archmage also possessed an indifferent and proud personality, and was difficult for others to be close to. His behaviors quite fitted the rumors. Ever since he took over Qinan Palace, the shrine fell into greater quietude. If there wasn't a major ceremony, it would be hard to spot the Archmage's shadow. In his second year as Archmage, Lady Qinghua asked Shang Jun to designate him as Junyo's prince consort. At the time, it was difficult for him to refuse with his unstable foundation. Nonetheless, citing that he was still underage and needed to train longer, they only performed the betrothal ceremony. The wedding was indefinitely postponed. After the engagement, he retreated behind closed doors within the shrine and spent his time practicing calligraphy and swordsmanship, planting trees, and playing chess. His only companions were the oil lamp and writing scrolls. The year Aranya got married, he had sowed a 4-season seed in the garden where he lived. He did not water it with sky water and it was thus slow to grow. After a lengthy 20 years, at the time Junyo's incident transpired, the first flower had only fallen off and given birth to the first fruit. Even though Junyo had greatly wronged him, she was Xiangli Yin's only blood and he could not abandon her. He knew as well as anyone that saving Junyo was akin to walking to his own death. The king was bound to take this opportunity to expel him from the shrine. But in life, there are things that seem to be hopeless yet in reality hold an unexpected way out. Xiangli Q was a tyrannical king. He had been eyeing the shrine from the day he ascended the throne. Zeiss had seen through him, but he had found it all too troublesome to deal with. This was why his successor was no more than a child when Xiangli Q took reign. Zais gleefully tossed everything to him to live freely in seclusion behind Qinan Mountain. Due to the complicated power play within the shrine, no one had noticed that Xiangli Q's ambition and intransigence had grown quite big. Although he was the almighty archmage in recent years, there were still some difficulty and constraints in everything he did. Once the shrine lost its archmage, Xiangli Q's obstinate ambitions for the shrine would not subside. If unfortunately Xiangli Q was cautious in recent years, he still had a way to provoke him. No matter how Qinan Palace was contending against each other internally, they would never allow for external desecration. The sooner Xiangli Q struck the shrine, the sooner the shrine's various forces would be able to put their grudges aside to fight their external enemy. He was the foreordained archmage. Even if Xiangli Q could depose him, once the imperial palace and the holy palace went at war, he was the only one who could safeguard Qinan Palace. Even those pedantic old magi would have no other choice but to welcome him back. This was retreating to move forward. He held such a high station, this young yet enigmatic archmage. He had the worship of the world, but life was hardly better than a wasteland. Perhaps with the help of the easterly wind sweeping away earthly dust, only in the lofty Qinan Palace could he see some four-season seeds. But they were nothing more than a few dormant seeds. But what sort of fate had let him see her again on Junyo's execution scaffold? She was dressed entirely in red, her white wings unfolding. Floating in the air, she looked down at him as her lips curved into a little smile. "Do you also remember? Although I didn't grow up with you as Junyo did, I am also your Mimi. Aranya, this is your name. From now on when I say this word, I'm calling your name. They all tell me an archmage's blood has the ability to cleanse offensive filth. After receiving your excellency's blood today, I wonder whether my blood will be much cleaner now. You're still so little. I bet you'll forget me by the time I come back. It was I who saved him, he is mine. I'll be back. When I become the archmage, I'll be able to take you out of here. Take a look around you, what is the current situation? I'm your only family. They don't want you, but you still have me. How can I forget? Aranya." But he now realized he had left her for too long. He didn't know since when she had also begun to learn how to seize and hold captive. He dreamed of her in those deepest recesses of his dreams. In them, he saw he was the one who rescued her from the snake pit, and it was in his embrace she had spread her wings. It wasn't that he hadn't thought there would be a day he'd fall into abjection. But if there was one person he didn't want to witness his abjection, it could only be Aranya. And yet, he was caged in her estate at this very moment. In a cramped space. Like a prisoner. No one likes to be caged. Then, she wrote to him using someone else's name as a mockery. He was an expert at hiding his emotions. He wouldn't be so angry if it hadn't been Aranya. Candle light flickered in the study. She was lazily leaning against the low divan when she said to him, "Have you ever thought that maybe I'm different from you, that you may hate me, but I don't hate you? Maybe I even really like you, and everything I did was to make you happy." If she wanted to make him happy, why did she borrow someone else's name? Why didn't she sign her own name at the bottom of the letters? He was furious. For the first time in his life he couldn't find anything to say. But she had laughed. I could be telling the truth, or I could be lying. Perhaps I do really like you, perhaps I just want to tease you. At the moment she said she might really like him, she was slightly tilting her head, on her face was an innocence he hadn't seen in a long time. Before she uttered the word like, he had never considered that those dormant four-season seeds buried deep in his heart could perhaps be love. Yet as she said those words, it was as if the seal on an enchanted box was finally broken and everything that was hidden inside began to gush out. Why did he undergo those long cultivations? Why did he want to save her? Why was she the only one who came to his deepest, most secret dreams? He had acted by instinct when he broke into the stone maze to save her from the Quinyin beast. After he held her and rolled out of the force field, she whispered into his ear, "You really do like me, Chen Yet." Holding her in his arms, he saw in her eyes an intelligent brilliance just like the time he taught her to read her name under the moonlight in their childhood. Yet ran. Her speech was incomplete. Those two incomplete words had perhaps been a harbinger. He was doomed to fall in love with her. He actually had never ceased to long for her. The following 2 years were a good stretch of time. He moved several four-season trees to Mengchun Manor. By summer, half were blooming while half were bearing fruits. Arania stood under the trees in thoughts. There was also a four-season tree inside the snake pit, she told him. These fruits were what I regularly ate when I was young. I heard that the snake pit did not have this tree in the past, yet overnight it took root and came to fruition. The heavens must have taken pity on me. She was trapped in the miasma of the snake formation. Sure enough, she no longer remembered those memories. That was all right, he thought. It was already enough like this right now. Whenever she was met with something, she would move a rattan bed underneath the shade of the four-season tree in the moonlight. One night as he was coming out from the glass-making room, in the distant layer of frost-like moonlight, he saw her lying on the rattan bed looking to be fast asleep. The large four-season canopy cast a slight shadow over her head. A poetry book slipped from her hand. He loved watching her sleeping figure. Her peaceful, dreaming face allowed him to instantly forget the many troubles in his heart. She was still by his side. White blossoms scattered on the rattan bed. He leaned down and watched her for a length of time, then picked one up and placed it in her hair. He stroked her temple, paused, then glided his fingers over her eyebrows, her nose, her lips. The first time he gave her a flower was also under a four-season tree. It was as though he was fulfilling his vow through this intimate act. You still have me, Arania. Having me is enough. A time later, he leaned down to kiss her forehead. She did not wake up. And yet, fate was starting to go wrong at this point. With the pretext of examining the progress of his mirror making, Lady Qinghua came to Arania's estate to speak to him. In the glass-making room, Qinghua's mask-like makeup was reflected on the two-sided mirror fragment in his hand. She said in a low voice, "Each day Xiangli Q remains on the throne is another day you can't return to Qinan Palace. I don't know what sort of plans you have, but I know you don't want to be trapped in here. You have always respected my late husband, and I haven't once forgotten his revenge. Why don't we help each other achieve our goals? If Junyo gets the throne, I vow on her behalf that the imperial palace will never offend the holy palace." According to his previous estimation, he could have forced Xiangli Q to wage war with the shrine if he was freed. But at this point, Xiangli Q was no longer as reckless as he had been before. His policy to suppress the shrine was like the eroding of termites. The shrine seemed fine on the surface, but he was sure Xiangli Q had supplanted much of the shrine from inside. He was not ignorant to outside affairs during the past 2 years of house arrest. He had been waiting for King Hua to come to him. When he was young, Zais often preached to him that Qinan Palace should never be involved in such a degradable thing if they could help it. Such things were beneath their style. He reckoned Zais had long expected that they would be involved in such degradable things one day. Since he didn't want to deal with it, he unloaded the burden onto him. With King Hua's help, Xiangli Q would definitely die. King Hua's intention was to help Junyo onto the throne, but whether Junyo ascended the throne or Crown Prince Xiangli He ascended the throne, what did it matter to him? Qinan Palace just needed for Xiangli Q to die. King Hua came to the estate thrice, appearing every bit sincere. He planned ahead and gave her a brocade bag. Using poison had never been an ingenious plan, but it was most suitable with King Hua's plan. Xiangli Q was suspicious in nature, so before that last step, there were quite many detours he would need to take. Which path should he take at each turn? What was required to avoid? Whom could he win over in the government? Whom could he start winning over? What would happen if certain things went well? What would happen if they didn't go well? He set out a thick stack of papers, like counting chips, each move needed to wholly precise. Although Xiangli Q had doted on King Hua, he had generally constrained her like a bird in a cage. She hadn't quite understood government and politics previously, but it was he who had shown her the way of the shrewd. 2 nights before Xiangli Q passed away, King Hua came to the estate again. He was drawing a lapis glass frame in the glass-making room. If it turned out well, they could make a mold according to it. Although she was his aunt, King Hua respectfully called him Your Excellency and negotiated with him the situation regarding Xiangli Q. She promised that he would be welcomed back to Qinan Palace immediately after the incident. He held the brush in his hand and focused on the parchment. If this goes well, I want Aranya. King Hua quickly looked up. He gave an appearance of indifference. She had unmistakably imposed many things on me, of course I will have to return them all to her. He glanced up to King Hua, frowning. Or does it pain you because she is after all your flesh and blood? King Hua was quiet for a moment. All right, after everything is over, Aranya will be yours. Since he would not be marrying Junyo, the shrine's power also shouldn't be falling into Junyo's hand. King Hua wouldn't let it fall to Aranya. This was the best excuse to bring her safely back to the shrine. But the biggest mistake in his entire life was underestimating King Hua. On the night of July 16, Xiangli Q passed away. On July 19, he was rushed back to the shrine to preside over Xiangli Q's funeral. Not more than 3 days later, an incoming message to the shrine said Aranya had assassinated the king and had been taken into custody. At the time, in the shrine's main hall, the black sacrifice bottle abruptly slipped from his hand, shattering on the ground. King Hua didn't keep her promise. Above and beyond his expectations, she had considered everything so thoroughly. Whether his feelings toward Aranya were pretense or truth wasn't something King Hua could possibly know. She made this move only in case there would be a day when, in the off chance, he developed any feelings for Arania and helped her threaten Junyo's position. She just wanted to put Arania to death. She had never thought of herself as her mother. How could he not have thought of this? Once, King Hua came to the shrine and spoke before him as though she was speaking out of a mother's difficulties. Your hatred for Arania runs so deep that I can't help but feel sad. She was wrong to have held you prisoner, but she's still my flesh and blood. I cannot bear to see her suffering persists. From how I see it, even if she did make a grave mistake, her death still won't be able to obliterate your hatred, will it? If you do this favor for me, whatever you need in the future, you just have to give me the words. Having said that, there was a perceivable sharpness as she watched for the reaction in his eyes. He frowned in seeming disgruntlement. A moment later, he slowly said, "There is a female scholar by the name of Wen Tian at the Imperial Academy. I'm not sure whether you happen to know her. If you want to make it up to me this time, can you take her in as your goddaughter? When I was downtrodden, she did not treat me poorly. We are each other's confidant and love. I want to make her my wife." King Hua's smile slowly emerged, finally relaxing a little. Of course. King Hua allowed for Wen Tian to keep him company at the shrine. When they met this time, a rare smile appeared on the face of the habitually temperate woman. She suddenly said to him when nobody was around, "I know you married me out of gratitude, yet do you know that the person who was the most gracious to you was in reality the third princess? Her Highness treated you so well, even I could see. This time, she is unjustly aggrieved but you just sit idly by. I did have feelings for you, but I found out today you're no longer someone I love." He didn't explain himself. Precisely in such times, he didn't believe anyone except for himself. Wen Tian had his admiration if she had said those words from her heart. If, however, she had said them by the will of King Hua to test him, he needed to be even more cautious. King Hua eventually believed him and loosened her surveillance. Additionally, Wen Tian was there. One day, he took advantage of Wen Tian's trip to the back of the mountain for sky water and went to King Ai Cave. King Ai Cave was where the most divine essence gathered in Qinan Mountain. For 2 years past, Zeiss had been living in isolation in this cave. Wingless arrows carried a folded letter past the force field enveloping the cave. In the letter were events relating to Arania's imprisonment. That year, Zeiss went into seclusion and led 2 magi with him to guard the cave. Although he trusted Zeiss, he did not trust the 2 guarding magi. He thus modified his handwriting in the letter. This time, he could only hope Zeiss would see the letter personally and leave the cave to save Arania. Times of urgency required greater composure and careful consideration. If Zeiss could save Arania, in a few months, he would quietly leave the shrine and reunite with her. If Zeiss didn't see this letter, the only other way was to move her execution to the shrine. By that time, albeit at only half or perhaps even less, he might still have some chances of protecting her to a successful escape. King Hua had calculated in such ways against him. If he was spared, he would not let her get her wish. Since she was bent on making Arania dead, he would make sure to place her onto the throne one day. In this vast world, he never had a loved one, neither did Arania. No matter how everyone was plotting against them, as long as they had each other, it was enough. On August 1, Arania was stolen away. It was also the day Xiangli He set off to the battlefield. When news came, he was presiding over a blessing ceremony for the expedition's army on Lingshu Terrace. Recently, there had really been too many derailments, but fortunately one thing finally went on the right track. He was right to have trusted Xi's. After Arania was stolen, he was placed under tighter surveillance. King Hua ultimately remained suspicious of him. But luckily she was well. Her safety was enough. Although he was at the shrine during the war with the Owl clan, he was informed of a thing or two whenever war reports arrived. But among the few things he knew, none included the fact that the person taking charge of the commander's tent at the Siing was Arania, not Xiangli He. On August 6, the army was driven back to the south of the Siing by the Owl clan and lost 30,000 soldiers. He took a stroll around the shrine and saw in the four-season garden a few fallen fruits that had been pecked by birds, showing a few brown seeds. He collected these seeds and stored them away. On August 8, Arania used the semicircular formation to stop the enemy, blocking the Owl clan beyond the river without any way to move. He cleared a space in the courtyard, sowed the seeds in the open space, then regularly watered them with sky water. The following day, the seeds grew into handsome saplings. On August 14, the Owl clan broke the semicircular formation. Arania resorted to the soul evocation sorcery and set the Siing ablaze in celestial fire. He changed out the soil for the seedlings. Green buds have begun to sprout in the past few days. There even flowered a pretty little bloom. He used magic to preserve it, thinking to himself it suited her well. On August 17, Arania died in battle. Her soul turned into ashes, disintegrating in the Siing. He lingered in the garden. The four-season tree was dense with branches. He took a pair of scissors and snipped a few blossoms, thinking to save them so that she could display them in a vase to admire in the future. Rumors spread that Xiangli He had died in battle and Arania had been executed for a capital offense. Even Xiangli Q's favorite daughter, Changdi, had gone mad after hearing the news of her father's death. In the large imperial family, only Junyo remained. On August 19, the exiled Junyo was welcomed back to the imperial city to succeed to the throne. On the 20th, Junyo personally visited the shrine to seek his benedictions. After the ceremony was completed, she invited him out for a stroll in the lotus garden. On the face of the simple yet self-preserving girl in the past was now full of vicissitudes. Gazing distantly into the water in the lotus pond, she at length said, "I lived 2 years in exile. Although there were some hardships, I felt I was truly alive in those 2 years. I've come to terms with a number of people, and I've come to terms with certain things. Among the three of us, Arania was the one who actually had a good upbringing. Growing up, I hated her so much, only because I was terribly envious of her unrestrained life. When she was just born, I remember I had been very fond of her." He didn't know what her intention was in saying this, and did not reply. "There are many things my mother didn't tell me," Junyo said a second later, "but I know deep down inside. I don't think it's true that Arania had assassinated the king." She looked back at him. "Cousin, my mother scares me sometimes. King Hua lived her entire life for this eldest daughter. A treacherous tigress doesn't eat its own cubs, but she did not care. She used the blood of her younger daughters to hoist Junyo onto the throne. Yet in the end, Junyo didn't feel an ounce of gratitude. Instead, she felt frightened by her. This was retribution. He lightly replied, "What you're afraid of isn't her, but the power she wields. You are now the queen, your mother shouldn't interfere in state affairs much longer." August 22 was a good day. The sun wasn't strong, and there was an occasional breeze. This weather was most suitable for visiting family and friends. As if he especially chose such a time, Lord Zais came to visit him at the shrine. At the time, he was reading in the four-season garden. Zais came in through the arched doorway and beelined for him. He was looking a little downhearted and resigned. He saved his greetings and sat down opposite to him. "The world outside has changed again and again, but how very leisure you are, hiding in seclusion here." He looked up and glanced at Zais. Then he turned another page and diverted his gaze back to his book. "I recall you used to say the shrine was an unworldly place. That being the case, what relation is there between those worldly things and an unworldly place?" Turning another page, he added, "Aranya, she." Zais frowned and cut him short. "I have never encountered love, so I naturally don't know how you and Aranya think. But since you've asked this question, you obviously also care for her. If that is the case, why bother pushing her to this point? Of course it's your two's business. It's not my place to say anything as an outsider. The path you chose, the path she chose, they were but your own fates." He sighed. "I came here today only because I remembered her wish. She had 20 letters at your place. Before she left, she asked me to take them back." It was as if Zais hadn't said a thing. The only word that drove into his ears like a long needle was "left." His fingers stiffened on the pages of his book as he slowly raised his voice. "Left? You rescued her, then let her go?" Zais was rendered somewhat befuddled, as if he didn't quite understand why he was asking this question. An ominous feeling suddenly took over his heart. He abruptly rose and headed to the garden gate. "Since you're here, you should have a way to help me leave this place. No matter where she went, if we leave the mountain this instant, we can still catch up to her. You don't know this, but she is one with many whimsies. Leaving her alone outside gives me a bit of worriment." He wasn't a talkative person, but he was afraid of being interrupted. But in the end, he knew himself what he was afraid of. He and Aranya only had each other. Fate was going astray again. But it must never choose this moment to go astray. What if even this one footstep was wrong? What if? As though he suddenly understood, Zais spoke from behind. "Did no one tell you? Chen Yat, Aranya went to the battlefield to trade places with," but he was cut short. "Don't say it! Don't say it!" As though if Zais didn't say it, everything as he had hoped would remain as he wished. The garden fell to a deathly silence. Only the cool breeze idly turned the pages, making some light rustling sounds. He grabbed the garden gate, his forehead was perspiring cold sweat. He was still struggling for a look of composure, as if the pretension was enough to make his deepest, completely self-destructive fears from occurring. But Zai's hesitant words stopped his steps. "Aranya, she," a slight pause. "King Hua showed your memorial to her. Before heading to the battlefield at the Sic, she said she might not have been meant for love in this lifetime. You were what she had fought for. Even if what she had with you was only illusory, she was fine with it. She just didn't expect you to hate her so much. No matter how generous she was, she couldn't bear it after all. She said she would be coming back. I didn't know she was going to the SIC to seek her own death. He spoke with extreme calm. Each of his words plunged into his heart like a sharp dagger. He knew Zai's didn't mean to, but he wanted the stabs to be deeper and more painful. That way, he would feel he was still alive, he would have the strength to refute Zai's. Aranya wouldn't die. I won't believe one word of it. Zai studied him for a moment, then lowered his voice. You may choose to believe it or not. He sighed. King Hua and Junyo only found out after she died. Because it was related to the power struggle in the royal family, they hid it from the courtiers. But I don't understand why they have to hide it from you. He didn't know how he could make a sound. Tell me, where is she? Zai's lapsed into a long silence. In the endless hush, he finally came to understand. The young mage did not want to believe, but he had no other option. But rather than believing him, he was more willing to believe his own eyes. At length, Zai said, having nothing left to lose, she unleashed the soul evocation formation. This frightening ancient sorcery consumed her soul, turning it to ashes and oblivion within the SIC. His figure shook fiercely. His feet staggered. His pace became more urgent. That day, the powerless archmage that was thought by the palace spies to have been too tightly guarded actually played under their noses and walked out of the front door on his own. Incredibly aggravated, they showed up one after another to stop him. With a face resembling an Azura, the archmage was armed with a single sword. In one flash, each and every spy was decapitated in his track. Out of almost 100 spies, only one remained alive. He was saved because he was a little spy who was always late to everything, including this time. After the archmage had left in the distance, the little spy quiveringly conjured a messenger pigeon and tied the news that the archmage had left the shrine onto the bird's foot to be delivered to King Hua and her daughter who were far away at the Sic River. King Hua and her daughter were at the Sic, according to the Bianiao's traditions, to pray for the fallen soldiers. On August 26, skeletons of soldiers piled high next to a tall terrace along the South Sic riverside. A few dotting clouds were drawn to the terrace where the queen was arranging a very large praying ceremony. After expediting for the past few days, he arrived at the scene precisely on today. The river that resembled a jade belt meandered around Pingyun Mountain. In the bright dawn, soft sounds rang out from the musical trees. Without food or drink, he had hurried along for the past few days, Aranya lingering in his blank mind. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind was filled with her image. She was so lively that she didn't allow him to believe she had left him. But how could he not believe it? He wasn't one to lie to himself. He had been on clouds for the past several days. Thoughts together with pain all had left him. He just wanted to come to the Sic. He came to look for her so that she would give him an answer, an ending. He never thought to escape from the Queen's ceremony. He was just strolling along the riverside, imagining the long journey she went through in her dying moments, that last path she walked in her life. What was she thinking when she was passing through this road? Did she still hate him? He walked to the end of the water where a tall tower was rising high. Banners and flags surged like wildflowers. King Hua's face came into his sight under the purple canopy. There was a rare panicking fright in her eyes. He didn't know whether his appearance was scary or not. He only knew King Hua had stiffened her face and sent down some order. Next, a shower of iron arrows charged at him. He instinctively drew his sword. The blade remained by the riverside, its powerful force field holding strong. However, the arrow shower was interminable. Eventually, he was pushed with nowhere to turn. A burst of wind suddenly picked up on the riverside. It sounded as though someone was playing an elegy from within the musical forest. White musical blossoms fell from their boughs, passing through the sharp arrow shower and landing on his sword's enchantment. A small blossom remained at his hilt like a pure white butterfly. It fluttered down, and like that, Aranya appeared in his sight. Raven hair, crimson gown, with a hint of a smile. She removed the white blossom from his hilt and played with it in her hand. Then she slowly slid it onto her hair, her fingers briefly stroking her temple before pausing. He ached so much inside. He wanted to reach out and grasp her, but he was only grasping at emptiness. It had been nothing more than the surviving shadows of the musical trees. While his mind was wavering, an iron arrow passed through the sword's enchantment and drilled into his shoulder. The strong force drove him back several paces. Blood from his mouth dyed the hilt a color of red. Having recently heard Mengchun Manor is hosting a new guest, I would like to send my greetings. I could be telling the truth, or I could be lying. Perhaps I do really like you, perhaps I just want to tease you. You do like me, Chen Yat. I sometimes feel it isn't enough, but I sometimes feel that your being this way is quite good already. He had lost her so many times, but he was now comprehending for the first time what loss really meant as he watched her shadow disappear from his sight yet again. That person. You would never see her again. You could never hear her speak again. You could never touch her again. She even decidedly gave up on reincarnation. No matter how many afterlives there were, no matter who you became, you would never be able to meet her. She was gone, completely and utterly gone. Immense pain from deep inside cut through him, spreading inch by inch. It was belated despair. He had never tasted despair in his life. Had he known this earlier, what were his forbearance for? What were all his earthly fears for? What was he staying alive for? Gales surged in, daylight from the eastern sky was instantaneously covered by dense clouds. The sword that was blocking the arrow shower suddenly burst forth a mysterious light. Flying arrows melted into nothingness when they met this light. It spread little by little like an intimidating burning stove, its blazing trail destroying everything in sight. This was an annihilative power. He didn't know since when he had had such a force, he just knew he had a desire to bury everything together. And once this desire arose, it was difficult to withdraw. He also did not intend to withdraw it. On the tall terrace, King Hua's and Junyo's eyes contained the shadows of trepidation. It made him happy seeing them so powerless. Here lay Aranya in eternal rest. There were mountains and water, there were flowers and birds. Since she could not come back again, being buried here with her would be his ending, it would also be everyone's ending. The nebulous mysterious light spread over the scene. The surging river quietly rose in vapor until there remained only the sediments in the riverbed. Junyo had fainted on the high ceremonial terrace several meters away. Only King Hua was still struggling to hold off. In this critical moment, from the thick clouds on the tall terrace suddenly emerged a figure. Zai Shenjun. This was ultimately an annihilative calamity. The former archmage who had always been carefree could no longer idly stand by. The former archmage was dressed in white, his sleeves fluttering a superior fairy essence. There was a weariness that couldn't be concealed from his expression. He did everything he could to confine the spread of the mysterious light as he faced him and said, "It's not that there isn't a way to save Arania. According to legends, Zhukongtian has a holy object called the Japo-lantern which can create souls for mortals. Although the Japo-lantern cannot be used for us earth fairies, everything has its inner workings. In accordance with the Japo-lantern's mechanics, you can create a sustaining soul to recreate another soul for Arania. And why not? Chen Yat, do you want to be buried here with her in regrets or do you want to see her again?" The floating mysterious light suddenly stilled. Zai's words had knocked some sense into him. He stared straight at the white-robed mage in front of him and asked hoarsely, "What do I have to do?" Zai said in lowered voice, "Are you willing to use your lifelong cultivation to create another world for her? She'll only be an artificial shell initially until you have patiently waited your due to rebuild her soul in order to make her completely resurrected. For this, are you willing to pay with your entire life?" He looked to the mage standing before him, his face was extraordinarily calm. "Now that I've already lost her, tell me, what wouldn't I be able to pay?" End of chapter 15. Chapter